One of the world's largest wars, World War I, seems to have demonstrated man's ability to exterminate his own kind. All sides of the conflict actively used flamethrowers, covering the battlefield with chlorine, which could kill enemy soldiers as well as their own allies. Each side tried to devise its most effective way of killing, and when the forces of the opposing sides became almost equal and the war reached a stalemate, turning into trench fighting, then a new weapon was created in Britain, the effectiveness of which is difficult to underestimate even now: the tank. Throughout history, tanks have taken different forms and had different applications, but the goal has always been the same: to break through enemy defenses. In this video, we will tell you about the greatest mass-produced, experimental, and even mythical models of these fighting machines. The SAR Tank, also known as the Flying Church, was an experimental Russian armored vehicle developed in 1914 to 1915 during World War I. Engineer Nikolai Lebedenko created this unusual tank, whose main purpose was to traverse trenches and obstacles on the battlefield. SAR Tank had a unique shape. It was a huge metal cylinder about 59 feet long, 39 feet wide, and about 29 feet high. It weighed about 60 tons and was equipped with 5 wheels for movement. The upper level of the cylinder was equipped with protective panels and machine guns for defense against infantry and light equipment. However, SAR Tank was unusual not only because of its shape, but also because of its technical features. For example, it was equipped with a rather unusual steering system for wheeled vehicles. Instead of the traditional steering wheels, tank drivers and operators used cranks to manipulate and steer the wheels. This system proved rather complicated and required special training to master. SAR Tank had its disadvantages. Because of its large size and weight, it proved inconvenient to use on the battlefield, and many of its designs proved ineffective. It was slow, difficult to control, and vulnerable to attack by enemy artillery. Only one prototype of SAR Tank was built, but soon, due to the country's worsening political situation, it was forgotten and the project was abandoned. 7 years later, the only prototype was scrapped. And it is possible to assume that the Russians assembled another tank from the scrap metal, namely the T-42 tank. The T-42 is a super heavy tank design developed in 1932 by German engineer Edward Grote. The design of this fighting vehicle was one of a number of drawings drawn upon by Grote specifically for the armament of the Soviet Union Army. This tank had 2 predecessors, which remained only on paper due to their complex design. The T-42, on the other hand, was more fortunate. The war leadership gave permission to build a prototype of the vehicle, which, by the way, was a serious challenge for tank manufacturing at that time. In addition to its enormous dimensions, with a length of 59 feet, a width of 10 feet, and a weight of 250,000 pounds, the tank had a rather complicated technical design. The difficulty in building such a tank was not only in its multi-tower. By the way, there were 5 of them, but also in the complexity of the chassis. Unconventional undercarriages would not be suitable for such a giant tank, so 34 double-track rollers had to be placed. Such a chassis made it almost impossible for the crew to repair the tank in the field. This was a great disadvantage because the enemy fire was often aimed at immobilizing a vehicle. In addition to the difficulties with the chassis, there were problems with the choice of engine for the tank. The Soviet Union simply did not have an engine capable of keeping such a massive tank in motion. And now for the most interesting thing of all, the armament. The T-42 was equipped with a main 107mm gun in the center turret. In addition, the front turrets were fitted with 45mm guns with dual 7.62mm DT machine guns. And the rear turrets were equipped only with dual DT machine guns and were used to engage air targets. The tank's armor would have been 70mm on average, which was generally very good for that time, and such a thickness could protect against many of the projectiles used then. On paper, this project looked very powerful and appealing. Still, in the field, the T-42, because of its size, sluggishness, and slow speed, would have made it an easy target for the enemy, making it unreasonably expensive and risky. That is why the project was subsequently abandoned and replaced by the T-35 heavy tank. But in comparison with some other projects, even the failure of the T-42 can be considered a success, because not only do we know for certain that its drawings were authentic, but even a prototype of this machine was created. As for the next tank, even in theory, it looked like something mythical. KV-6 Behemoth, KB-5 Bis, or Stalin's Orchestra, is a super heavy tank of Soviet origin, about which there is more conjecture and speculation, but which has never been officially put into service and has never gone into production. Information about the KV-6 Behemoth is limited to secondhand sources, photographs, and drawings found in archives and archival photographs. However, these sources are ambiguous and incomplete, and much about the KV-6 Behemoth remains a mystery. According to some sources, the KV-6 Behemoth was a design for a super heavy tank developed in the USSR during World War II. The tank was supposed to have massive armor and powerful weapons to withstand modern and potential adversaries such as German Tigers and Panthers. Some sources also claim that the KV-6 Behemoth would have had multiple turrets and heavy armaments, such as 107mm or 152mm guns. However, there is much debate and controversy among tank historians about the existence and real characteristics of the KV-6 Behemoth. Some consider it a fictitious project, a mock-up created to disguise real developments, or just an unconfirmed or unreliable source of information. The information about this fighting vehicle says it was supposed to be a full-fledged combat locomotive on tracks. The tank was to have 3 turrets, each with its own unique armaments, mortar, cannon, and reactive system. In essence, it was a combination of several fighting vehicles in one, namely the T-60, BT-5, T-38, KV-1, and KV-2 tanks. The main turret was supposed to be the turret from the KV-2 tank with a 152mm gun. In front of and behind the main turret were 2 turrets from the KV-1 tank with some differences. Namely, the turret in the front, in addition to the 76mm gun already installed in it, had a turret from the T-60 tank with a 20mm gun. The rear turret was very special. On top of it was placed the BM-13 multiple rocket launcher, or the Katyusha. Also, according to some reports, there might have been a turret from a T-38 tank with twin 7.62mm DT machine guns between the central and frontal turrets. As for the size of this behemoth, it reached 72 feet in length, 10 feet in width, and weighed 305,000 pounds. Overall, the KV-6 Behemoth remains an enigma in the history of tank building, and little is known about its actual performance, design decisions, or possible prototypes. Information about it is limited to unofficial sources, and there is no reliable evidence of its actual existence. But let's move on from imaginative designs back to more realistic projects. The FCM F1 was developed in 1939 as a response to the need for a powerful armored vehicle, capable of withstanding other super heavy tanks of the time. It was 39 feet long, 10 feet wide, and weighed about 320,000 pounds, making it one of the heaviest tanks in history. The main armament of the FCM F1 tank consisted of one 90mm or 105mm cannon on the main rear turret, one 47mm cannon on the front secondary turret, and 4 7.5mm machine guns. The armor of the tank was thick and heavy to provide protection against enemy fire. The tank was equipped with a tracked undercarriage and could reach speeds of up to 15 miles per hour. In general, the undercarriage was almost entirely borrowed from the B1 tank, except for the wider design. However, because of its size and difficulty in production, the FCM F1 project was stalled, and not a single vehicle was ever built. Production of this machine was hampered by the German invasion of France in 1940. By the way, the Germans probably were one of the most advanced nations in terms of tank development. All of you probably know about the German Tigers and Panthers, and if the aforementioned models of tanks were put into mass production and showed themselves on the battlefield as formidable machines, some of the German tanks did not even get to the prototype creation stage. The Kolossal-wagen, also known as Colossal Panzerwagen, or simply Colossal, was a German super heavy tank developed at the end of World War I. It was one of several experimental tanks designed by Germany at the time, intended to destroy fortified positions and break through front lines. It had a weight of up to 330,000 pounds, a width of 10 feet, and a length of about 39 feet. The armor was intended to be up to 200 millimeters thick to provide high protection against enemy guns, mines, and grenades. The main armament of the Kolossal-wagen was supposed to consist of 4 bonneted 77mm semi-automatic guns and 7 7.92mm MG-08 machine guns. This tank did not have a conventional turret, but was replaced by sponsors, chambers on either side of the tank. These housed the main guns of the fighting vehicle. The undercarriage of the tank was located not on the sides of the vehicle, but in the center, behind the sponsons and armor plates. Externally, this fighting vehicle looked more like a bunker than a tank. The development of the Kolossal-wagen did not progress far, as it was recognized that this tank was not suitable for active combat and breaking through the front lines. It was too slow and clumsy, which limited its use to positional combat. Only 2 copies of this machine were produced. In general, unsuccessful projects are quite a frequent occurrence in the world of tank building. Sometimes, even machines that seem to be extremely successful on paper can be, in fact, completely unusable. The Menal Leaf tank project is one of the very few projects of such a fighting vehicle. Its development took place in the period from 1905 to 1915. The designer Vasily Mendeleev, who by the way was the son of the famous Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev, worked on the designs. This tank had the simplest design of all mentioned above. It was supposed to be a box on tracks with a 120mm cannon centered in front of the vehicle. In addition to the main gun, the Menal Leaf tank also had an auxiliary 7.62mm Maxim machine gun mounted in a cylindrical turret on the top of the tank. Despite the simplicity of its design, this tank was of enormous dimensions. It was 32 feet long and 13 feet wide, with a vehicle weight of 381,000 pounds. This machine would more properly be called a mobile bunker, and not only because of its size and shape. The tank had a cutting-edge pneumatic suspension system, which allowed the hull to be lowered to the ground to cover the tracks and reduce the recoil of the gunfire. In this condition, it was easy to mistake it for a real bunker. For its size, weight, and armament, this steel fort still would not have been as effective on the battlefield as its designer had imagined. After all, the 120mm main gun had a horizontal aiming angle of only 16 degrees, which, with the overall sluggishness of the tank, made it unusable for firing at moving targets or fortifications that were far apart. In addition, the gun turret location was not the most appropriate, as the gun was located too high and close to the center of the vehicle, which meant that everything in front of the tank or behind it was in the blind spot. In general, the tank's design was advanced for its time in many respects. However, its enormous weight, which severely limited its top speed and high fuel consumption and technical complexity, prevented the tank from being realized in practice. Therefore, this project remained only in the blueprint stage. While the Menal Leaf tank could be called a steel fort or bunker, the land cruiser P1000 Rat, for example, could be called a city on tracks. The land cruiser P1000 Rat, which translates from German as rat, is a design of a super heavy German monster tank developed during World War II. Although the tank was never built, it remains one of history's most famous and fascinating tank designs. Interestingly, the Rat project was designed by engineer Edward Grante, who was responsible for developing a similar project called the TG-5 and the T-42 super heavy tank for the Soviet Union. Development of the land cruiser P1000 Rat began in 1942 as part of the Wunderwaffe program, which called for the creation of unique weapon systems for offensive operations. According to the design, the tank was to be 114 feet long, 36 feet high, and 46 feet wide, weighing over 2,200,000 pounds. Thus, the Rat would have reached an impressive size and would have been one of the largest tanks in history. Precisely because of its gigantic size, some have called this project a land ship. The tank was to be equipped with 2 8,400 horsepower engines each, which would give it a speed of up to 25 miles per hour. It was also supposed to have 128mm, 150mm guns, 8 20mm Flak 38 anti-aircraft guns, and 28 7.62mm and 15mm machine guns. But the tank's main gun was to be 2 SKC 34 283mm naval guns. And as you can imagine, this giant would need a large crew to operate such a huge number of guns and keep the 2 ships' engines running. By design, it would have had a crew of 36. However, the development of the Rat was plagued by many technical and financial problems that prevented the project from being completed. Ultimately, only a few mock-ups were created, and no tank prototype was ever built. Some sources claim that German commanders sought to create the Rat to attack Allied ports and use it to bolster Berlin's defense. However, the question of the real effectiveness of such a monster remains open, and many experts believe that the Rat was more of a science fiction project than a real weapon of war. So, how effective do you think such a tank would be in combat? Leave your opinion in the comments. And also, if you liked the video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Here, you will find a lot of interesting things. And if you want to support the channel financially, the link to Patreon is in the description. See you around.